So in this same shelf, the main stuff that we have here is more up your alley. So there is, again, you're the one who arranged this. I would have done Chinese, Japanese, Korean, but you put Japanese first. So I'll ask you why you put Japanese before Chinese. So
because Chinese had big books, so I put it on top.
So so I've got a lot of Japanese stuff, and again, Japanese is a language. When I was in Korea, I decided to learn Japanese really well, and I studied really hard, and I got pretty good at it, and then I decided I had to let it go, and so I kind of like tried to banish it. But when I think about learning it again, I really, just for the comparative context, because Japanese is so similar to Korean, it really is a shame kind of not to have it. And Japanese literature and is always quite rich, and I'd like to have that. So I've got what we were talking about before about learning languages, so through other things. So if I were to go back, I mean, I've got some really, they might be old, okay, but I always thought that this Helmut Buske Verlag, Japanese, Japanisch Intensiv, looked extraordinarily thorough, and I love the way this Chaplin manual reading Japanese, this just looks incredibly comprehensive, and this very old, like World War II vintage, I think, book for Japanese. Just there's so much really good comprehensive stuff for learning Japanese that it would seem one of obviously learning a language that's very different is hard, but when you have good materials, it's so much easier. There's so much good material for learning Japanese, so that's very attractive. But more than that, what we were talking about before, like using French to learn Portuguese, or Spanish to learn Catalan, or Dutch to learn Frisian. I am with my Korean. We're at a point where I could use Korean to learn Japanese, and so I've got these wonderful, basically bilingual manuals of Japanese conversation with Korean, and they're If I were to go back and make another stab at Japanese, I would definitely do it from a Korean perspective. So I've got these books in particular, and then this whole little series of books that you put with Korean, but they're actually they're bilingual Korean Japanese, and I've got tapes they're for learning Japanese, but you've got the Korean bilingual text, so that would be a very useful thing to use. So Japanese. And then Chinese, so I guess we kind of arranged. I've got one book for non-Mandarin. I've got one Cantonese book. I have nothing for Wu or anything else. So everything I have is either Mandarin, modern Mandarin, and I guess there was a point when I thoroughly mastered this and the Chinese course and these. And I was able to read the history of the Journey to the West.
This is the records of the Grand Historian.
Yeah.
The 史记, right?
Yeah, so I've got that as a text, and I've got a couple of other. And you put the big ones up here. I have this wonderful. Here's the Journey to the West, and the Dream of the Red Chamber in traditional characters, and I've got this, with audio. Yeah, Chinese is, I've got tons of stuff for learning how to read Chinese, advanced Chinese, Chinese grammar. This is a beautiful book that I practiced Chinese calligraphy with. It's got very large, relatively large characters and the like with stroke orders. So I really enjoyed this book. And then backed into a corner over here. I've got all my classical literary Chinese. So this is stuff that my good friend Fred Royal, who studied classical Chinese at the University of Chicago, I think he gave these to me when he left that, unfortunately. And you said you'd never seen volume 3 in person. So here it is of Shattuck's volume 3. It actually does exist. So I made my way kind of, I guess, through some of these things. Not that's you said that's the language you know best, so you should teach me that. So then down here, talk about imbalance and stuff. So I've got more for Korean than anything else. So I've got, because I really immersed myself in Korean and I lived there and I acquired it. I wrote books on Korean. My wife teaches Korean, so I've got tons of Korean grammars, all of these are Korean bilingual texts. Most of these are, all of these, I would say, are they're intended for Koreans learning English or even Spanish. So here's Spanish and Korean. So they're intended for Koreans who are learning these other languages. So they have bilingual texts, and so they've cottoned onto that, the value of bilingual texts. But you just turn that around. So it's I use these to really improve my Korean vocabulary and Korean reading by reading bilingual texts that way. And then the most important thing I've discovered in my own studies of Korean was that you need to know the classical Chinese characters in order to understand the vocabulary. You can't learn it without it. So I've got a couple. Where'd you put them? I've got some readers of his mixed script, Guide to Chinese Characters. I've got a couple of other readers with Chinese characters, and this'll teach that. Lots of books for learning Korean, and some of my own publications on Korean verb conjugations that I wrote with Professor Kim Jong-nok back at Handong University, and some other stuff that I published for Dunwoody, a North Korean reader, and Korean newspaper reader, and more bilingual texts, and some other stuff. So tons of stuff for Korean, some for Chinese, some for Japanese.
The North Korean reader. What inspired you to start this, and how different is it from, let's say, South Korean?
I think they asked me. Dunwoody asked me to write it. Yeah.
Really?
Dunwoody asked me. We approached Dunwoody with this book. So Professor Kim and I wrote this book, and we approached them with that. And then because they published that, they asked me to do the Korean newspaper reader and the North Korean reader.
I see.
And there's also a North Korean workbook that I don't think I ever got my own copy of, now that I think about it. So there's a North Korean workbook that goes with that. North Korean, actually, it's over here. The best book for learning Korean, period, is this one. Wilfried Hermann Lehrbuch der modernen koreanischen Sprache. And it's probably out of print, and it's North Korean, but it's just it's North Korean. And it's just so actually, when I wanted to learn Korean, I was screwing around with little things like this, which has got nice pronunciation, but it's got this romanization that I blacked out so I wouldn't have to see it. I went through the whole book and crossed out the romanization. There just wasn't a lot of good stuff for learning Korean at that point. And then I found this, and this is like totally thorough and systematic and covers everything. And so I was in Pohang, South Korea, and trying out these North Korean phrases and terms on people, and they all thought it was kind of strange and weird, but it was also strange and weird for some. I think Korean has come a long way in terms of foreigners learning it now, so I don't think it's strange at all for foreigners to be learning Korean now, but back then it was. And they thought that was strange, but Professor Kim and the other Professor Kim and there were like 5 Professor Kims in the Department of International Studies and Language and Literatures, they all thought it was great because Korean linguists, South Korean linguists, seem to have a consensus that North Korean is better Korean, purer Korean. It's got less like Anglo loan words. It's they got rid of more Chinese characters. It's pure Korean. So it's, I don't think you'd have to look at the sociological factors of North Korean defectors living in South Korea. It's not all that different in this text. So the things precisely, so you look at this, here's a text, and what's different? The things that we put in things. So these are like grammatical and phonological differences between North and South Korean, and these are word differences. So this is how I organize this. So if you know South Korean, these are the words. This is the South Korean word for member. This is the North Korean word for member. So you can see in any given text, there's not too many different words, and there's some different sounds and grammar. It's like American English and British English.
I see.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And again, North Korean, though, they got rid of the Chinese characters. So actually, while I like the fact that my Korean colleagues encouraged that and say that North Korean is pure Korean, I don't think you can get rid of the Chinese etymology of the Korean language as a whole. And in my experience as a Western learner of Korean, the hardest thing about Korean is like, why do these words mean what they mean? It just doesn't mean they make any sense to me. But once I started learning these, it made perfect sense to me. What the here, let me show the English one. You can see how this is all old. Once I started learning these, then my vocabulary just doubled and doubled and doubled again, because you understand why words mean what they mean.
So if, let's say, you wanted to do a more historical approach to the East Asian languages, right? So what would be like the equivalent of, like Gothic or Middle High German? What would be the equivalent of that?
This could just be my ignorance, but I don't know that you have it. I think you've been too unified and centralized in classical Chinese. I don't think that there's that variety. It's like, if you didn't have these things for the Germanic languages, if you only had the Romance languages for the longest time, if you'd gone back to the year 1000 and you asked some monk in a scriptorium, how many languages are there? And he said, well, there's Arab, I guess there's also Arabic and maybe Hebrew and Greek, that he'd heard about as things, because the language meant something that you could write down and had something written in. So language was synonymous with Latin, and they didn't think of spoken language as that. And so Korean invented the Hangul script back King Sejong in like 1470 something, but people didn't use it for 500 years because the literati, they thought, well, why would we want to use this script? And we all know how to write Chinese characters, and that's a real thing. So I think that the universal dominance of classical Chinese sort of pre-opted that and did other things. And then I'm also told, we were talking about this the other day, that Shi Huangdi, he wanted to the first emperor who unified all of China, the guy who started the Great Wall about 500 BC. He wanted to be
200 BC.
200. Okay.
Yeah.
He wanted to be the first, and so he ordered all the books burned. Right. So we don't, Chinese. I think you have some bone divination shards from about 3000 BC, but you actually, because it was all burned by internal command, you don't have a lot of text, before whatever you said, 200 BC. So there might have been something out there, but it was all unified into classical Chinese, and then it was sort of auto-destructed. So I'm not sure you can do that project. I think the Japanese wrote some Japanese alongside classical Chinese for longer than Koreans. Koreans, refused to write their own language. They wrote only classical Chinese, but used that. But, and I think classical Chinese was in Vietnam for a long time too. So, but yeah, I think it was kind of unified as an international pan-East Asian literary script, and sort of like Latin was used, throughout, sort of Europe for the longest time. So along those lines. So yeah, in terms of learning branches and seeing historic relationships, Germanic is probably the one that has the most variety and the most things, because again, you can even what I just mentioned in Europe, the Latin languages, Latin is so strong that you don't have as many or as much as early attestation of writing in some of the early Romance languages as you do in Germanic languages.
I see. Okay, so even Romance, even with the stuff we have here, it's still a bit hard.
It's easier than with East Asian, but
Right.
yeah, I think if you want to understand a branch and you have things, what I did was I think Germanic is probably maybe Indic. Let's go to Indic. I
Okay,
think Indic
yeah.
also. Indic has possibly something. Quite possibly has stuff to rival Germanic. That's just something not I've studied as much. So let's go over here.
Okay.
Talk more about that.